Hi, I'm Arnie Gundersen from Fairwinds, and March represents the 4th year since the beginning of the triple meltdowns at Fukushima Daiichi. These were disasters that were man-made. Tokyo Electric would have you believe that they're the victim of an unimaginable tsunami that rose up from the ocean and destroyed the plant. But in fact, they are the perpetrators of this disaster. They knew in 1965 that a tsunami this size or even bigger could rise up, and they chose to keep the tsunami walls short to save money. The same sense of skewed priorities occurred while the disaster was occurring. Tokyo Electric underestimated the releases, they underestimated the exposure to people, they underestimated the time to recover and the cost to recover. Does that mean that Tokyo Electric is incompetent? I don't think so. I've seen the same behavior occur at 3 Mile Island, at Chernobyl, and now at Fukushima. The response of a bureaucracy in a disaster like Fukushima is to save the bureaucracy and to save nuclear power. Nuclear power means a lot more to the bureaucrats than the health and safety of the people that they're supposed to be protecting. Why is this? I'm reminded of the Watergate movie and the famous quote, "Follow the money." It will happen again because this mentality infuses the nuclear industry. Costs and the success of nuclear power are more important than the health and safety of the public. With us today is Chiho Kaneko. Chiho is a member of the board at Fairwinds and recently returned from Japan. Hi, Chiho.
Hi, Arnie.
I wanted you to share with us your impressions, having just come back 4 years after this disaster.
If you just go to Tokyo, you wouldn't know that in a big disaster like Fukushima Daiichi happened. Everything looks pretty normal. But if you travel to Fukushima, and especially to the towns and villages near the nuclear power plant, the life there has completely changed. In many towns and villages, people still are not allowed to return. So there are ghost towns. And on the coast, you see still upturned cars from the tsunami disaster, untouched, unclean, still left after 4 years.
So these buildings that are destroyed from the tsunami can't be repaired because they're also radiologically contaminated.
Correct. And also communities with people, they are destroyed. Physically, people are not living there. A lot of people are not living there. And even though in towns where people are allowed to return, people have trouble going back to their homes because maybe they no longer have work, jobs that they used to have, or maybe hospitals and schools that they used to go to, or in the nearby towns, and which might be not allowed to enter kind of area. So their infrastructure that supported their life, daily life, is no longer there.
But yet there's a pressure from the Japanese government to bring these people out of the disaster relief zones and push them back into their own villages.
Yes, I think that there are incentives for people to go back. And I wonder why that is. And, in some ways, I think the municipalities, they're really worried about their towns and villages just disappearing completely, just going out, which is a palpable sort of a reality, And then people's also love of the place, which is different from their love of the town or village, but their love of the mountains and the rivers. That's a very strong desire. So in some ways, I think by encouraging those people to go back, government can save money, of course, because instead of paying hundreds of thousands of people to just live outside, compensation, if people can actually return there in a contaminated area, government can save money. And in a small country like Japan, that's a temptation.
How are the people in the state of Fukushima Prefecture, how do they feel having to leave the area where they were born and potentially now come back into an area that's highly contaminated from a radiological disaster?
I think they're confused and they're worried, especially people with small children in the family. They're very worried. You know, I've heard many people, older people say, you know, they may be able to eat contaminated food, but they will never want their grandchildren to eat. You know, those stories you hear over and over. But it's very difficult to sort of see what's actually in your food. So people are kind of second guessing, and there's the confusion.
As I understand life in Fukushima Prefecture before the disaster, there were communities that were there for tens of generations, where ancestors are buried for tens of generations, where people worked for generation after generation in family farms. It would seem now that that's all been thrown up into the wind.
Right. People still grave sites and graveyards. I spoke to a man from the village of Kawauchi, which is 20 to 30 kilometer zone, so 12 to 18 miles zone. Currently he's living in a temporary refugee unit in Kodiyama. He said his wife died in 2011, sometime in the fall. She could not take all the relocation from one shelter to the next and finally to the temporary unit because she had some physical condition. And so he said he buried her in the old village, even though he's not living there.
And as I understand it, it's important to honor your ancestors, at least in the yearly holiday, but in addition, there's a deep connection to ancestors that is broken now because of the disaster.
I think that the people's love of the place was mountains and rivers and just natural, like 4 seasons, beauty. That is really strong. You know, even today, people really long for their home. And yet, their sense of like being part of a community, like a municipality, for instance, I think that's crumbling. Because the town or village or whatever, a municipality, it's not functioning, physically and also emotionally. Sometimes in some areas, a municipal head, like a mayor or something, is at odds with its people because people felt like the mayor put the interests of keeping the village structure intact ahead of people's lives. So that kind of a community fracturing happening all the time, as well as within a family, people are fractured, not intentionally, but out of necessity. I spoke with a woman who owns a gas station with her son in the village of Kawauchi. She returned there with her son soon after the disaster, only to she wanted to feed her daughter's cat. So she just, at that time, apparently she was able to return, even though evacuation order was in place. And she was also visiting the coastal town of Tomioka, where her son used to live, because everybody just kind of left in a rush, as soon as they realized that the nuclear power plant was just blowing up. So she was going into the highly contaminated areas to pick up stuff for her son and his family, and which itself is kind of a mind-boggling. It's almost like that was allowed to happen is mind-boggling. But my point is that she and her son actually returned to the gas station in the village of Kawauchi. Why? Because the son felt like he really wanted to take care of the old folks who stay there. Apparently there are some people who just couldn't go or something. And he wanted to make sure that they're kept warm. So out of that commitment, and I think out of the love for the place, not the town per se, but for the place and the community, they returned. And sad thing is that her son, has a wife and a child, now a third grader. So her son's wife and daughter, they now live outside of Tokyo because they're concerned about the radiation effects on the little girl. And so, which is a really difficult thing. The wife and the daughter visit him maybe a few times a year. And every time they have to leave, they cry because they love the girl loves the dad. And the woman whom I talked to said that's the hardest thing to see. What's the most important thing? I think it's the family, she said. And she said unequivocally that fact that Japanese government is trying to restart nuclear power plants is completely outrageous. It's out of question. She doesn't want anybody else suffer like this anymore. No disaster like this should ever be allowed to happen. But as long as nuclear power plants operate, you cannot guarantee that disaster like this will never happen. You cannot guarantee.
And this is a society, and I said it when I was in Japan 3 years ago, that the beginning of the atomic age was, unfortunately, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the opposite bookend could be Fukushima Daiichi. It could begin in Japan and it could end in Japan. And yet there's pressures on the people to allow these plants to start up. It just seems so sad to me.
This same woman who owns the gas station actually said something rather macabre. She said that she was shocked once when she was watching the television. A boy, I think a junior high school student or something, from the town of Okuma, which is the host community of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. A boy from that town on camera said that, well, I think nuclear power plant and TEPCO, they have been a sort of lifeline of my family, indicating that maybe his family member might work there or something. Therefore, I think restarting nuclear power plants in Japan probably is necessary in order to bring back the sense of security and prosperity.
I found that a lot, where if you believe that a nuclear disaster is not going to happen again, then you can buy into that mentality that let's start them back up again. But history's shown that we've had 5 meltdowns in 35 years. 3 on my island, Chernobyl, and 3 at Fukushima in 35 years. So that means that once every 7 years, there's going to be a meltdown somewhere. And yet people say, well, it won't happen in my plant, so it's okay to start my plant back up. I just do not understand that mentality. I'd like to talk a little bit about the collection of all of this radioactive material all throughout the state of the Fukushima prefecture. Can you tell us what you saw? Well,
especially in sort of 11 or so municipalities, in and around Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. But even outside that too, so you're talking about many cities, towns, and villages in Fukushima. You have this huge bales that contain, like plastic bales, I think, contain radioactive soil and maybe some grass piled up, in some cases alongside public roadways, in other areas maybe just in abandoned rice fields or something.
So as you're driving down the road, there'll be thousands of piles of huge bags that contain radioactive material, and they're all being consolidated into even bigger piles, which ultimately are going to get consolidated into a couple of huge piles of bags, of millions of bags of contaminated soil.
It's really amazing to see, because it's almost like incredible. I mean, I couldn't believe my eyes. Sometimes the piles are like 5 or 6 bag high. So at first when I saw it, is that some kind of construction, building construction or something? But no, it was they're just piling those bags on top of each other because there is really not enough place to put them. And I read somewhere that this is some month ago, but over 76,000 locations where those big piles of those bales are housed today.
And the bags are designed to last for 3 years, but the radioactivity inside them will last for 300 years. So as the bags break down, that radiation then gets into the groundwater and recontaminates the communities that are supposed to be now cleaned.
Well, apparently the central government promised the Fukushima municipalities that those bales are going to be removed to a little more permanent location within 3 years. So they promised that over 3 years ago. So now the towns and village heads are getting frustrated because now it's been 3 years or more, and those bags are still sitting there. Yeah. But the idea is that ultimately those contaminated soil and debris, whatever, will be transported to just around Fukushima Daiichi site, where now they're going to build a temporary nuclear waste facility.
A lot of those drums are put into holes in the ground that are then lined. We actually did a story about 2 years ago where a cut in the liner that's only an inch long will leak 60,000 gallons of water a year into the groundwater. So there's no way that a liner can be perfect. And so as these drums or bags are thrown into this pit, if the liner has one rip in it that's an inch long, 60,000 gallons of contaminated water will leave that and get into the groundwater.
Well, I don't know how they're going to then safely transport all the bales to the temporary repository, because they're going to have to, and I think they're going to start experimenting with the transporting of it pretty soon.
The other piece of that is the waste that's being burned in incinerators. Yeah. The bags of tree limbs and grass and dirt are one issue, but now there's larger pieces that are being burned throughout Japan. We did a story about 3 years ago about the incineration of waste in Japan, and it's not safe for 2 reasons. First off, there are filters on the building, but the filters don't get all the radiation. The particle size, and I'm getting geeky here, but the particle size of the individual cesium atoms is so small that it blows right through the filter. So they're essentially taking contamination from the soil, throwing it back up in the air again to have it land on areas where they've already cleaned out.
Well, this incinerating radioactive waste is actually a huge problem, and it's not just a problem for Fukushima. I'm from Iwate, which is, the 120, 150 miles north of Fukushima, but we too have radiation fallout from the meltdowns. And so there are a lot of radioactive grass, hay, and logs to make shiitake mushrooms, as well as shiitake mushrooms themselves. Once they're deemed above the limit for the government, set standard of radiation, they're going to be treated as a nuclear waste. And what the Environment Ministry is trying to do is to reduce the volume by incinerating it. But then that is, like you said, and their point is that the 99.99% of the cesium will be captured in those filters. But a lot of citizens are now standing up to protest the burning because they don't believe that everything is going to be captured. And they think that this is going to cause secondary radiation fallout unnecessarily.
Yeah, I would support them absolutely.
Yeah.
The filter size is too big and the atoms are too small, and they will go right through those filters and redeposit. So it's not just the mushrooms that are contaminated, though. As you work your way around Japan, I imagine there's contaminated rice, contaminated fish, contaminated beef. How do people feel about eating Japanese-grown products?
I think, to be really blunt about it, people are less worried today compared to 4 years ago, except that there are some people who still really scrutinize the origin of the sort of produce. And, some people say they'll never eat anything that comes from Fukushima or vicinity. But that's a tricky thing because, food monitoring is happening in Fukushima. And even in my home prefecture, Iwate, to some extent, which is, as I said, 120, 150 miles away from Fukushima Daiichi, they're still testing, school lunches in my area too. But then, if the food monitoring shows that this food is under the sort of a government set, threshold of like 100 becquerel per kilogram, then it might contain some radioactive matter, but it can be solved. So if you think about it, food you take directly in your body. So whatever small amount of like a cesium or strontium-90 or whatever, if it lodges in your body, then it doesn't matter how small the amount is. It will keep emitting radiation, and it can damage your DNA. So that is a concern, internal radiation exposure. That is a concern. And especially mothers with small children, they're very concerned.
I've run into a lot of people who say who don't really realize that the American standard for radiation in fish is 12 times higher than the Japanese standard. So what the Japanese won't eat, they could, if they wanted to, ship to America, and they could sell it here for that it's unfit to be eaten in Japan. It's truly a double standard of horrendous.
I do not like to think that, but I guess technically that's permissible, right?
Yeah.
In America.
Yeah, yeah. It's sad. The other issue is downblending of rice, for instance. If some rice is contaminated that it can't be sold, if you take that rice and you spread it out into more rice, you're okay.
You mix in with the not so contaminated rice, and it dilutes the sort of radioactivity. Then repackage it.
From a health physics standpoint, though, the same number of people are going to get cancer. You're more likely to get it from the one bag, but as you spread that radiation out among more bags, the number of people exposed increases, but the amount they take in decreases. The net effect is the same. The same number of people are going to get cancer from that rice. It's just that they'll be further away from Fukushima Prefecture, and it'll be harder for the statistics to catch it.
That's true.
Yeah, I have to go back to the remarks I made at the beginning of the hour. It's really all about following the money. And this is a industry that protects itself and protects the bureaucrats, but really, really doesn't look out for the people.
And I'd like to add that what I have witnessed in the past 4 years really reinforced the impression that once a nuclear disaster happens, nobody, not a government, not the nuclear industry, nobody can control the result. Its spread, its time span, its effect on communities, they cannot control.
The genie's out of the bottle. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry.